After my wife of 41 years was buried, I learned she'd left me a boarded-up hardware store on a dead street in Galena, Illinois, while my daughter walked away with the lake house in Lake Geneva worth $2.4 million. The afternoon the will was read, my daughter looked me in the eye and called me a worn-out old fool who couldn't be trusted with a checkbook, and told me I had 30 days to clear out of the only home I'd ever known. I had nowhere to go, so I drove 4 hours northwest to a town I'd never set foot in, and forced open a swollen wooden door that hadn't moved in years. But when that door finally gave way and I stepped inside, what I found made my legs go out from under me. Hey everybody, welcome back. Before we get going, do me a favor and hit that like button, subscribe if you're new here, and let me know down in the comments what state or country you're watching from. I read every one of them, and it always amazes me how far these stories reach. Quick heads up before we start. Parts of this story have been dramatized for the telling. But the heart of it, the part that matters, that's as real as it gets. Now let me tell you what happened. The conference room downtown smelled like burnt coffee and lemon furniture polish. I remember then more than anything else from that day the smell. I sat on one side of a long table that was too big for the four of us, and across from me sat my daughter and her husband, the two of them leaning in like they were waiting for a slot machine to pay out. The lawyer handling Margaret's estate was a soft-spoken woman, with silver reading glasses perched on the end of her nose. She'd worked with my wife for the better part of a year, though I didn't know that yet. At the time, I just thought she was some stranger about to tell me how the rest of my life was going to go. It had been 9 days since Margaret passed. 9 days of casseroles on the porch, of people I half recognized squeezing my hand at the funeral home, of my daughter handling what she called the arrangements, which mostly meant she stood in the kitchen on her phone while I sat alone in the dark living room staring at Margaret's empty chair. And now here we were. The lawyer cleared her throat and began. To my daughter, she read, I leave the property on Bonnie Brook Road in Lake Geneva, Wisconsin, along with its contents, current appraised value approximately $2,400,000. My daughter let out a little breath, the kind you let out when something you've been holding tight finally comes loose. Her husband patted her knee under the table. The lawyer kept going. To my daughter, I also leave the brokerage account held at the firm in Chicago. Current value $1.1 million, and the proceeds of the life insurance policy, $400,000. I did the arithmetic without meaning to. 40 years of teaching shop class will do that to you. Almost $4 million, all of it going to our girl. I wasn't angry. Margaret and I never cared much about money for its own sake. I figured my share was coming, and it would be the house in Rockford and maybe the savings, and that would be plenty for an old man on his own. Then the lawyer turned the page. To my husband she read, and my chest went tight the way it does before a doctor gives you the results. To my husband, I leave the commercial building at 214 South Main Street, Galena, Illinois, along with all of its contents and the lot it sits on. Tax assessed value, $91,000. The room went dead quiet. My daughter blinked. She said, Wait, what is that? The lawyer looked up calm as still water and said, It's a building your mother owned in Galena. It came to her from her side of the family. It's been in the family since 1952. My son-in-law leaned back in his chair and laughed, just one short, ugly bark of a laugh. A junk store, he said. In Galena. That's a tourist town 200 miles from anywhere. He gets a dump, and we get, what, a fraction of what Mom was actually worth in real estate. My daughter put her hand on his arm, but she didn't disagree with him. She turned to the lawyer and said there had to be a mistake, that her father wouldn't even know what to do with a commercial property, that he was a retired school teacher who'd never run a business in his life. I should have said something. I should have defended Margaret or defended myself, but my throat had closed up and the words wouldn't come. All I could think was, why this? Margaret never once mentioned the building in Galena. In 41 years, she never took me there. I didn't even know it existed. The lawyer slid an envelope across the table to me. Thick cream-colored paper, sealed. On the front, in my wife's handwriting, the slanted, careful script I'd know anywhere, it said, Open this when you get to Galena. Trust me. My hands shook when I picked it up. My son-in-law stood and buttoned his jacket. This is ridiculous, he said. We're talking to our own lawyer. The estate attorney folded her hands and said, That's certainly you were right, but I'll tell you now. Margaret's estate plan was put together by one of the best firms in the state, and it's airtight. Contesting it will cost you a great deal of money and end exactly where it started. My daughter looked at me then. Really looked at me, and for a second I thought she might soften. Instead she said, "Dad, you're not actually going to take this, are you? You're 66 years old. What are you going to do with a falling down store in the middle of nowhere?" And I said, "Your mother wanted me to have it, and that was the only answer I had." They left. The door swung shut behind them and the room felt enormous and empty. The lawyer took off her glasses and rubbed the bridge of her nose, and she said something I didn't understand at the time. She said, "Your wife loved you very much, Mr. Holloway. She was the most deliberate woman I ever worked with. Open the letter when you get there. She wanted you to read it standing inside that building. Then she handed me a heavy old brass key on a loop of twine, and she said, 'Call me anytime, day or night.' Margaret told me you'd have questions. I drove back to Rockford that evening, except it wasn't my home anymore. Not really. The will gave the Rockford house to my daughter, too. I'd find that out soon enough. But that night, I still walked through the rooms where Margaret and I had raised our girl, where Margaret had died 3 weeks earlier in a hospital bed by the window, holding my hand and whispering words I couldn't make sense of. "Trust the store," she'd said. "Everything you need is there, sweetheart." I thought it was the morphine talking. It was around 8 when my daughter came by. She didn't knock. She had a key, of course. She had a key, and she walked into the den where I was sitting with a manila folder in her hand. "We need to talk," she said. She set the folder on the side table. "Notice to vacate," she said, like she was reading off a grocery list. "The Rockford house came to me in the will. You've got until the end of the month. 30 days. I just looked at her. "Honey," I said, "I've lived here 35 years. And she said, "Dad, my husband and I are trying to start a family. We need the space, and you got somewhere to go now. Go live in your store." I told her I hadn't even seen it yet, and she said, "Well, then I guess you'd better drive out and look." At the door she stopped and said one more thing, casual as anything. "Don't take any of the good furniture when you go. The antiques, Mom's jewelry, the silver. That's all part of the house, and the house is mine." Then she was gone, and I sat alone in the den holding an eviction notice in one hand and a brass key in the other, listening to her car pull out of the driveway I'd shoveled every winter for 3.5 decades. I picked up the cream envelope and looked at Margaret's handwriting. "Trust me," it said. "Maggie," I whispered to the empty room, "what did you leave me?" The next 3 weeks were the worst kind of slow and the worst kind of fast all at once. My daughter wasted no time. She had a contractor out within days, measuring the den for what she called a nursery renovation, and I watched a stranger in a tool belt carry box after box of my life out to a dumpster in the driveway. Most of it I let go, but there was one morning I'll never forget when a young guy was hauling out a framed photo from the mantel. Margaret and me at the lake the summer we got engaged, 1982, her in a yellow sundress laughing at something I'd said. I asked if I could keep it. He looked at my daughter, who was supervising with a coffee in her hand, and she said the frame was real silver, worth a couple $100, and it stayed with the house. I told her I didn't want the frame. I wanted the photo, and she said the photo's in the frame and pointed the kid toward the dumpster. I watched my wife's face disappear over the rim of that bin, and something in my chest cracked that I don't think ever fully healed. I want to tell you about Margaret, because you can't understand what came later without knowing her. We met in 1981 at a county fair of all places. I was 25, teaching shop and metalwork at the high school for $19,000 a year. She was 23, fresh out of school with a degree in chemistry and a job offer from a paint and coatings company nobody had heard of. We married at the courthouse, no big wedding, just her sister and my brother as witnesses, and a weekend up at Devil's Lake for a honeymoon. 2 years later, our daughter came along, and Margaret took 8 weeks off, and then she was right back at it. She never could sit still. She loved the lab, loved the patents, loved the long drives to industrial clients in Indiana and Ohio. In 1994, she left the company and started her own outfit, a specialty coatings firm. I remember her telling me at the kitchen table, and I said, "Maggie, we've got a mortgage and a 10-year-old. And she just smiled and said, "I know this chemistry better than anyone in the Midwest. Trust me." And she was right. By 2003, she'd sold the firm's main product line for more money than I made in 20 years of teaching. I kept teaching anyway. I liked my kids, liked my shop, liked the smell of sawdust and the look on a teenager's face when they finished their first real piece of furniture. Margaret offered to let me retire early a dozen times, and I always said no. Our daughter grew up with everything: private school, a car at 16, a college fund that covered every dime, and somewhere along the way she stopped seeing us as people and started seeing us as a balance sheet. I don't know exactly when it happened. Maybe it was always there. By the time she married a man who measured every conversation by what it could get him, the two of them spoke about Margaret's money the way some folks talk about weather, like a thing they were entitled to and just waiting on. Then came the spring of 2022. Margaret came home from what she'd told me was a routine checkup, sat down at the kitchen table, and said 5 words that ended the life we knew. The doctors found something, Frank. Pancreatic. They gave her 18 months, and she got about 14. I retired the next week. From that day on, every hour was hers. But even sick, even shrinking before my eyes, Margaret kept secrets. Drives she wouldn't explain. Phone calls she'd take in the other room. The estate lawyer coming and going. Once I asked her what she was working on, and she just patted my hand and said, tying up loose ends, "Don't you worry about it." I should have pushed. But she was fighting for every breath, and I couldn't bring myself to add 1 ounce more to what she was carrying. The last clear night she had, she pulled me close and said, "Frank, trust the store, the one in Galena. Everything you need is there. Don't let our girl take it from you. Promise me." And I promised, even though I had no idea what I was promising. She died the next morning. 63 years old. At the funeral, standing in the back where he thought I couldn't see, was a man named Edward Holt, who'd run a rival coatings company for 30 years and had fought Margaret over contracts and patents for most of that time. He never came up to me, never said a word. I figured grief was making me see things. About a week before I had to be out, I was hauling trash to the curb when a folder slid out of the recycling bin my daughter had filled. The tab read, in my son-in-law's handwriting, "Dad, Care Facility Options." Inside were glossy brochures for a place called Cedar Crest Assisted Living down in Pekin, photos of a dim cafeteria and old folks parked in front of a muted television. Underneath was a contract. Resident, my name. Shared room. $2,900 a month. Move-in date, the 15th of the next month. And the date printed at the bottom, when it was drawn up, was from February. 2 months before Margaret died. While she was still alive in our bedroom fighting for air, the two of them had already signed the papers to put me away. I sat down right there on the curb. I looked the place up on my phone. 2 stars. Reviews about residents left in soiled beds, about food that made people sick, about a wedding ring that vanished and was never found. I photographed every page and hid that folder in the trunk of my car under a blanket. I didn't know yet what I'd do with it, but I knew I'd need it. The morning I finally left, my daughter was waiting on the porch. She held out a check. $20,000, she said. For the store. Sign it over, and we'll call it even. You walk away clean. No hard feelings. I looked at that check a long time. Then I tore it in half and again and handed her the pieces, and I said, "I'll take my chances." Her jaw went tight. "You're making a mistake," she said. I put my bag in the truck and I drove away, and in the mirror she got smaller and smaller until the road bent and she was gone. The drive out to Galena took most of the morning. Rockford gave way to farmland, then to those rolling green hills they call the Driftless. The part of the Midwest the glaciers somehow forgot, all bluffs and river valleys and barns leaning into the wind. By the time I rolled into Galena, it was past noon. This old river town built up the side of a hill, brick storefronts from the 1800s. The kind of place tourists drive in for a weekend to buy fudge and antiques. I found South Main, and there it was, number 214. A narrow 2-story brick building with a faded sign I could barely read. Big front windows papered over from the inside. A door that hadn't opened and I didn't know how long. Most people would have walked right past it. I put the brass key in the lock and it turned hard, like the building itself didn't want to wake up. The door scraped open over a drift of dead leaves and old mail, and the smell hit me first. Dust and old paper and something underneath it. Faintly, the lavender hand cream Margaret wore her whole life. My heart about stopped. I stepped inside. It was a single long room, an old retail floor with empty shelves, a wooden counter, a staircase at the back going up. And on that counter sat 2 envelopes, one sealed with red wax, the one from the will reading, the other in Margaret's hand with my name on it. I set down my bag and I picked up the sealed one and I said out loud, "All right, Maggie, show me. But before I break that wax seal and tell you what was inside, do me a favor. Drop the word trust in the comments just so I know how many of you have stayed with me all the way to this moment. And a gentle reminder, parts of this have been dramatized for the telling. If that's not your cup of tea, no hard feelings, this is your stop. But if you want to know what my wife hid in that building for 2 years while she was dying, stick with me. Because this is where everything turns. I broke the seal. Inside was a single sheet and it said, "Frank, if you're reading this, then I'm gone, and our daughter has already shown you who she really is. I'm sorry I couldn't say all this to your face. Some things are safer on paper. Go upstairs. In the back room, there's a closet, and behind the false wall on the left, there's a steel trunk. The key the lawyer gave you opens it. Everything you need is inside. I love you. I always have, more than I ever managed to say." Emero. I went up those stairs 2 at a time, 66 years old and moving like a kid. The back room was small, an old office. I found the closet, knocked along the left wall until it sounded hollow, and pried loose a panel that had been cut to look like part of the plaster. Behind it sat a green military-style footlocker with a brass padlock. The key fit. Inside were 4 folders, each labeled in Margaret's careful hand. One said survey. One said our daughter, marked with a red tab. One said Holt, blue tab. The last said trust, and resting on top, another envelope with my name on it. That second letter I read sitting right down on the dusty floor. "Frank," it began. "There are 3 things you need to understand. First, our daughter and her husband have been stealing from us. Over the last 18 months, they moved a little over $300,000 out of our joint accounts, forging my signature, routing it through an account in his name. I caught it in the fall of 2022. I never said a word. I just started writing it all down. The red folder is the proof. Second, our son-in-law has been working since 2021 with Edward Holt, my old competitor. Their plan was to get me to a place where I couldn't fight, push you into a home, take control of you through a guardianship, and then sell this building and the land under it to Holt. The blue folder has their emails. Third, Frank, this building and this whole block sit on top of something. Years ago, the city designated this stretch of Main Street for historic redevelopment, and the air rights in the land assembly here are worth far more than anyone in our family ever knew. Holt figured it out before our daughter did. I've already negotiated a deal with a legitimate developer, a good firm, that values this property and the parcels I quietly bought alongside it at around $11 million. The trust folder explains everything. I put it all in an irrevocable trust in your name, 18 months ago. No power of attorney can touch it. No guardianship can reach it. And the trust has a clause, section 40-something, the lawyer will walk you through it, that says if our daughter contests the will, or works with Edward Holt, or tries to have you declared incompetent, she forfeits every penny of what I left her. Frank, I know you still see the little girl who used to fall asleep on your shoulder, but she made her choices while I was dying. Don't let her make them for you too. Protect yourself. Protect this. It's yours now. Trust the store. M. I read it 3 times. My hands were shaking so bad by the end I had to set it down on my knee. $300,000. Forged checks. While Margaret was on chemo, while I was driving her to appointments and reading to her at night, those 2 had been emptying our accounts. I opened the red folder and there it was, a timeline in Margaret's handwriting. Bank statements with dates and amounts highlighted, photocopies of checks with her signature forged, the loops all wrong, the slant off, and a sticky note on top that read, "Found it September 2022, watched them 6 months, documented everything, let them think they got away with it." M. Then I opened the blue folder, and that one was worse. Email after email between my son-in-law and Edward Holt, going back to 2021. Holt writing things like, "Your mother-in-law's company sits on patents I want. But the real money is that block on Main. The city's going to redevelop it within 5 years." My son-in-law writing back, "She doesn't know what it's worth, neither does my wife. What's the play?" And then a later one from Holt, after Margaret's diagnosis became known, cold as a stone, that said the timeline accelerates. Once she's gone, you handle the old man. Get him declared unfit. Get the guardianship. Sell me the Galena property for $1 million and I'll make you whole. There was a draft contract. $1 million for a building in a block of land Margaret valued at 11. And in the margin, in red ink, Margaret had written one word: theft. I don't know how long I sat on that floor, long enough that the light coming through the dusty upstairs window had gone from white to gold. I thought about my daughter at the lawyer's office calling me a worn-out old fool. I thought about the $20,000 check I'd torn up that morning and how it had nothing to do with kindness. They weren't trying to help me. They were panicking because the old man wouldn't sell. That evening there was a knock at the front door downstairs. 3 slow, heavy raps. I went down and opened it to find a man about my age standing under the streetlight, weathered face, flannel shirt, a thermos in one hand and a brown paper sack in the other. "Frank Holloway," he said. "I'm Walt Bremer. I run the feed and hardware out on Route 20. Your wife asked me to keep an eye on this place. Figured you'd turn up about now." He came in, set a battery lantern on the counter, poured me coffee from the thermos, unwrapped a turkey sandwich, told me the power had been shut off years back, but he'd get a generator running for me in the morning. Then he reached into his jacket and handed me an envelope. "Margaret gave me this a year and a half ago," he said. "Told me if you ever showed up here alone, I was to hand it over." Inside was $20,000 in cash, banded in hundreds. "She paid me to watch the building," he said. "Check the locks, run off anybody who came nosing around. And lately, son, somebody's been nosing. Your daughter's husband's been in town 3 days now, asking questions down at City Hall about zoning and air rights, and there's an older fellow with him driving a black Cadillac." I knew then Holt was here too. Walt tapped the counter. "Don't sign a thing they put in front of you," he said. "The lawyer's got your back. So do I." And before he left, he told me one more thing. "Check the office closet again, behind the trunk. There's a fireproof box. Margaret said you'd know what to do with it." I found it that night, a small steel box wedged behind the footlocker. Inside were copies of everything in the trunk, and taped to the lid a flash drive labeled FBI copy and a business card. Special agent on it. White Collar Crime Division. Chicago Field Office. My wife had been talking to the federal government. She'd built a fortress around me and I'd never seen a single brick of it go up. They came 2 mornings later. I heard the cars on the brick street before I saw them. My daughter's SUV and behind it a long, black Cadillac. She got out first, then her husband in a suit, and then an older man, silver hair combed straight back, a vest and no tie, the kind of man who's used to people doing what he says. Edward Holt. My daughter came up the walk and said, "Dad, we need to talk," and I stood in my own doorway and said, "No, we don't." Holt stepped forward smooth as oil and introduced himself. Said he understood I'd come into a difficult property, that the taxes and the upkeep were a lot for a man on his own, and that he'd like to make it simple. $10 million, he said. Cash. Today, I sign over the deed. He takes care of everything. I walk away free. I looked at my daughter and said, "You brought him here." She wouldn't meet my eyes. And then I took my phone out of my pocket. I'd recorded a call 2 nights before, when my son-in-law had phoned thinking I was asleep, talking to somebody about the guardianship petition being ready, about the place in Pekin, about how the old man taught shop class for 40 years and had no idea what he was sitting on. I played it right there on the sidewalk. My son-in-law went white. Holt's smile fell off his face like a picture off a wall. That's when the lawyer's car pulled up. She got out with her briefcase, calm as church on Sunday, and behind her a man in a developer's polo shirt. She handed Holt a folded document and said, "Cease and desist. Your name specifically in the trust Margaret Holloway established, and any attempt by this family to transact with you triggers forfeiture and a referral to the U.S. Attorney's Office, which I made this morning." Then she turned to my daughter and handed her a second set of papers and said, "Your mother's trust contains an ethics provision. By bringing Mr. Holt here, by participating in a scheme to obtain guardianship over your father, you have triggered it. As of this moment, you forfeit the lake house, the brokerage account, the insurance proceeds, all of it. It reverts to your father." Then she gestured at the man beside her and said, "This is the developer who holds the real agreement on this property, executed under your mother's trust, and the deal that matters here was signed 18 months ago." I watched my daughter's face go from anger to confusion to something that looked, for just a second, like the little girl who used to cry when she skinned her knee. She said, "Dad," and nothing else came. Holt got in his Cadillac and drove off without a word. My son-in-law followed. My daughter stood on the brick a moment longer, then she turned and walked to her SUV. And she drove away too, and the street went quiet. Just the wind and the old buildings and me standing in the doorway of the place my wife had built to keep me safe. It mostly ended the way these things do, not with a bang, but with paperwork. My daughter's lawyer told her what mine had already told me, that the trust was ironclad and fighting it would only deepen the hole. She withdrew everything within the week. Edward Holt was arrested 2 months later. Federal charges, wire fraud and conspiracy, and the news said the case had been built largely on evidence provided by a confidential source, a woman who'd worked with the FBI for the better part of 2 years before she died, my Margaret. They offered my son-in-law immunity to testify against Holt, and he took it. Of course he did. And in the taking of it, he lost his license to practice, lost his standing, lost the marriage too. My daughter filed for divorce that fall. The developer broke ground on the Main Street project the following spring. My quarterly checks come like clockwork now. More money than a retired shop teacher knows what to do with. So I did what Margaret would have done. I started a scholarship at the high school where I taught, for kids who want to work with their hands, machinists and welders and carpenters, the trades nobody respects until their furnace breaks. I named it after her. The first year we sent 4 kids to technical college, who never would have gone otherwise. And at the little ceremony, a girl with grease still under her fingernails from her after-school job told me she wanted to build things that last. Don't try to be like me, I told her. Be like the woman this is named for. I never heard from my daughter again. Not really. A card came 2 Christmases back, no return address, just her handwriting that looked so much like her mother's, it stopped my heart. I'm sorry, it said. That was all. I didn't write back, not out of spite. I just didn't have anything left to say that wouldn't reopen a wound I'd finally gotten to close. Wal Bremer still comes by on Sundays. We sit out front on 2 folding chairs and watch the tourists go by. And sometimes he asks if I ever regret not answering that card, and I tell him the truth, that I regret she made it impossible, but I don't regret protecting what Margaret built with the last strength she had. I'm 70 now. Every morning I unlock that front door, the same brass key, and I water the little planter of yellow flowers I keep on the sill, the same kind Margaret wore in her hair the day we met at that county fair a lifetime ago. People ask me what all this taught an old man, and I tell them the same thing every time. The building was never the treasure. The fight for it was. My wife saw something in that worthless old store that nobody else could see, and she saw something in me too. Something I'd stopped seeing in myself. She spent the end of her life making sure that when the people who should have loved me tried to throw me away, there'd be walls around me they couldn't get through. So if you take one thing from an old man tonight, let it be this. Don't wait for the worst day of your life to find out who you really are. And don't let anybody, not even your own blood, convince you that you're worth nothing. Because sometimes the thing they call worthless is the only thing that turns out to be real. And every now and then, if you're very lucky, somebody loves you enough to know that before you ever do. For a long time after it was over, I'd sit in that dusty store at night and try to understand how a family comes apart this way. And the truth I kept landing on is that nothing here happened by accident. My daughter didn't wake up one morning a stranger. She became one, a little at a time. Every time she chose what she could get over who she could love. Her husband chose Edward Holt's money over his own marriage, and in the end the choosing cost him the marriage anyway. Holt chose to treat a dying woman's life's work as a parcel to be carved up, and a federal courtroom eventually returned that choice to him with interest. Every door that slammed in their faces, they built with their own hands, board by board, long before they knew it. And Margaret. Margaret is the other half of that lesson. The half that gives me hope on the hard days. Because she could have spent her last 14 months bitter or frightened, or just plain worn down by the cancer and the betrayal both. Instead, she did the hardest thing a person can do. She stayed clear-headed when her heart was breaking. She figured out exactly what was being done to us, and then she had the patience to say nothing, to watch, to write it all down, to build something quietly that would hold long after she was gone. That took a kind of strength most people never have to find. It also took her refusing, even at the end, to do anything underhanded or cruel in return. She didn't poison our daughter against anyone. She didn't lie or steal back. She just told the truth carefully to the right people and let the truth do the work. There's a right way to fight, and she found it. What I want you to take from an old shop teacher tonight is simple, but it isn't easy. Be the kind of person who can be bought, because the people who can be bought always end up sold. Pay attention, really pay attention, to what's happening around you even when it hurts to look. Because Margaret saw what I refused to see. And her seeing it is the only reason I'm not in a shared room in Pekin right now. And when life knocks you flat, the way it knocked me flat in that lawyer's office, don't lie there. Get up, drive the 4 hours, force the door open, and find out what you're really made of. You're tougher than the people who threw you away ever believed. I'm 70 now. I water the yellow flowers on the windowsill every morning, and I think about the girl who used to fall asleep on my shoulder, and I forgive her in my own quiet way, not because she earned it, but because carrying the anger costs me more than it costs her. The building was never the treasure, the fight for it was. And the person I became in that fight, the one Margaret believed in before I ever did, is the only inheritance I'd never trade.